probably like me. No matter how difficult it might be, you're looking for a new challenge to keep life interesting. Since you're watching a video on cedar strip canoe building, I'm guessing that's true. Building a canoe is a huge undertaking, and it's extremely rewarding paddling a canoe that you've built. I'm getting way ahead of myself in this intro because there is still a long way to go in this build, though it's helpful to see where you can be someday, even if it's early in the build. In the last video, I installed the mold stations. It was uplifting because for the first time I could see the shape of what the canoe could be. In this episode, I'll begin planking the canoe. It's a big step, so let's get started. We'll be using a lot of glue while planking, and we don't want to glue the cedar strips to the stations. As you'll see in a future episode when the hull is complete, applying painter's tape to the edge of each mold station won't entirely prevent the hull from sticking to the stations, but it will prevent it from being permanently glued to them. It's rewarding putting the first cedar strip on, but I was overthinking this in the early stages of building the hull. Here I meticulously balanced the long strip with one finger to find the center, then marked it with a pencil and made sure that the center of the strip was right on the center line. While doing this doesn't ruin the build, it's just completely unnecessary. After the third or fourth strip, I took the lining up and stapling the strips based on how they looked. There are so many ways to build the hull. I've chosen to use staples to hold the strips to the station molds. You'll see the staple holes after the hull is complete, but after sheathing, varnishing, and what feels like sanding for centuries, the staple holes will be barely noticeable. Most builders choose to keep strips as straight as possible while building the hull, and many builders would say my method is complete idiocy. And they're likely right. As I explain my method, let me know in the comments how dumb I'm being. Okay, here goes. The strips are flexible and can bend along the 17 to 18 foot length they are ripped. Noticing this, I figured it would be easy to build the hull with the strips flowing with the lines from bow to stern. I thought this would be true even with the high recurve on each end. Later in this video, you'll see why this makes building the hull challenging, but not entirely impossible. Canoe building is not only about boat making and woodworking, it's also about problem solving, and you'll see many of the creative ways I got around both my mistakes and lack of boat making knowledge. Don't let this discourage you from building your own canoe. Rather, use my problem solving as encouragement that even a rookie boat builder like myself can build a buoyant vessel. The key is the ability to never say no to a good challenge. After the first strip was stapled to each station, I walked along the length of the future hull, squeezing glue into each cove of the strip. Then I slid the bead of the new strip onto the glued cove below. I went a little crazy with the amount of glue I used. This doesn't hurt the build, it's just a waste of glue and creates more work when smoothing and sanding the hull once it's built. Like oil and water, the strips of the hull will want to separate, and I'll need to keep it together as the glue dries. Especially the way I've chosen to build the hull, by following the curve of the bow and stern. In these circumstances, the go-to is duct tape and bubble gum, but I'll choose a more appropriate tool here and hold it down with the same painter's tape I used on the edges of the station molds. While it felt like a losing battle to reduce the amount of glue I used, wiping off the excess after I taped them together helps a bit here. After I trim the edges of the strips at the bow and stern, I'll want them to hold to the inner stem. Here I'll glue the inside ends of the strip and hold them together with some mini clips. In some cases, my painter's tape wasn't enough to hold the strips together. I'll use as many of these plastic clamps as I have to hold them together. As I build the hull, the plastic clamps proved to be very useful. From here, the early stages of building the hull is straightforward. Apply glue to the cove of the previous strip, insert the bead of the next strip into the cove, staple at each station, tape it down, cut the ends off at the bow and stern, and move on to the next strip and repeat. If you remember, I started building the hull by following the curvature from stern to bow. It's not an incorrect way to build a canoe, just more difficult. As the hull begins to take shape, I need to find a way to keep the strips from separating after applying glue. The closer I got to finishing the hull, the more creative I needed to get to keep the strips together. To make this happen, a combination of clamps, straps, L-shaped scraps of wood, and something creative at the most challenging sections, the bow and stern. Holding the strips to the stems at the bow and stern become more difficult as I get closer to finishing the hull. Here's where I'll have to use some of those problem-solving skills I mentioned earlier. The strips are being pulled into many directions here. To keep them in place, I built a frame around the bow and stern and held the strips to the inner stem with scraps of wood and clamps. I didn't think this would work at first, but I was pleasantly surprised when they did, and the strips held after I removed the scraps of wood, the clamps, and the frames. When I talk with others about building the canoe, usually at a gas station with the canoe on top of my Jeep, or even while paddling, I often tell them I learned way more about problem solving than I did about woodworking or even boat building.
And I learned a ton about boat building and woodworking when I made it, but I learned way more about problem solving because each step of the way, I had to learn how to do something new.
All the creative ways I used to build the hull, using clamps, straps, scraps of wood, and building the frame around the bow and stern are great examples of that. When I finally put in the whiskey strip, it made all the challenges worth it. For the first time since starting this build, my canoe looks like it could float. Thanks for watching me problem solve through all the challenges in this episode. I'll see you in the next one.